Can a coward become a hero in the space of a single hour? Can a man who spent his entire life running from confrontation suddenly find the courage to stand and fight when everything inside him screams to flee? Is bravery something you're born with, written into your character from birth? Or can it emerge unexpectedly in the most desperate moments, surprising even yourself? What happens when the weakest man in your unit, the one everyone doubts, the one who doubts himself most of all, is suddenly thrust into a situation where he's the only one who can save his friends? Does he crumble under the weight of expectation? Or does he discover a strength he never knew existed? I'm asking these questions because I lived the answers in July 1944, in a small village in France whose name I can barely pronounce but will never forget. I was that weak man, that coward, that soldier everyone had written off as useless, and for 1 hour on a summer afternoon I became someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize, someone who did things I never imagined I was capable of doing. This is the story of how a terrified clerk who'd never fired his rifle in combat became the man who saved his entire company. This is the story of discovering that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being absolutely terrified and acting anyway. This is my story, and I still don't fully believe it happened. My name is Harold Vincent Pritchard, and I was the least likely hero in the entire United States Army. I was a 26-year-old accountant from Cleveland, Ohio, skinny and bespectacled, with terrible eyesight that somehow passed the induction physical, probably because they needed bodies more than they needed standards by 1943. I'd been a bookish, cautious person my entire life. The kid who got beat up on the playground and never fought back. The teenager who avoided sports and confrontation. The adult who worked in an office and went home to his apartment and lived a quiet, safe, utterly unremarkable life. When I was drafted in early 1943, I was terrified. Not the normal anxiety anyone would feel about going to war, but a deep, paralyzing fear that consumed me completely. I knew I wasn't cut out for combat, knew I'd be the first one killed, knew I'd let everyone down. Basic training was a nightmare. I couldn't do the physical requirements, couldn't keep up on the long marches, couldn't hit targets on the rifle range, couldn't throw a grenade more than 20 feet. The drill sergeants hated me, called me Four Eyes and Professor, and worse names I won't repeat. The other recruits tolerated me but didn't respect me, saw me as dead weight, the guy who'd get them killed when we finally saw combat. I tried my best, really tried, but my best was pathetic compared to everyone else. I failed the rifle qualification twice before barely scraping by on the third attempt. I couldn't do a single pull-up. I got lost during every field exercise. I was, by every objective measure, a terrible soldier. My salvation came in the form of my pre-war experience as an accountant. The Army discovered I was good with numbers and paperwork, and they assigned me to battalion headquarters as a company clerk. I'd handle personnel records, morning reports, supply requests, all the administrative work that kept a combat unit functioning. It was a rear echelon job, relatively safe, exactly what a coward like me needed. I was relieved beyond measure, grateful to spend the war behind a desk instead of behind a rifle. The other soldiers made jokes about it, called me a chair-borne ranger, but I didn't care. I'd rather be mocked as a clerk than dead as a rifleman. I shipped to England with the 1st Infantry Division in October 1943 and spent months working in headquarters, processing paperwork, staying far from actual combat. The Big Red One had fought in North Africa and Sicily, was a veteran division with a proud history, and I was proud to be associated with them even though I wasn't really one of them, not a real soldier. When D-Day came, I landed on Omaha Beach on D+2, after the worst fighting was over, after the beach was secured and the war had moved inland. I saw the evidence of what had happened, the destroyed equipment and the graves, but I didn't experience the battle itself. I set up my desk in a Norman farmhouse and went back to processing paperwork while the real soldiers fought and died pushing inland. By July 1944, the division was still grinding through the hedgerow country of Normandy, fighting brutal, exhausting battles for every field and every village. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards, and casualties were horrific. The hedgerows were ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, perfect defensive terrain that gave the Germans every advantage. Each hedgerow was a potential ambush site, each field a killing zone. The fighting was as bad as anything the division had experienced, and the casualty rates reflected it. I processed the morning reports every day, typed up the KIA and WIA lists, saw the numbers climb, but I remained safe in headquarters, doing my job, grateful to be far from the fighting. On July 18, 1944, everything changed. Our division was ordered to attack toward the town of St. Lo, part of the preparation for Operation Cobra, the breakout that would finally crack the German defenses and allow us to break free from the hedgerow country. Every available soldier was needed for the assault, including headquarters personnel who could be spared from their duties. I was sitting at my desk, working on supply requests, when Captain Morrison walked in and told me I was being attached to Baker Company for the assault. They'd taken heavy casualties and needed every warm body they could get, even a clerk who barely knew which end of a rifle to point at the enemy. I stared at him in disbelief, certain he was joking, but he wasn't. "Grab your rifle and equipment, Pritchard. You're going to the line." The terror that gripped me in that moment was absolute. I physically couldn't move, couldn't stand up from my desk, my legs wouldn't work. Captain Morrison had to practically drag me to my feet, had to push me toward my bunk to get my equipment. I was shaking so badly I could barely buckle my web belt, couldn't load my rifle because my hands trembled too much. Another clerk, a corporal named Jenkins who'd become something like a friend, helped me get my gear together and walked me out to the truck that would take me to Baker Company. "You'll be fine, Pritchard. Just keep your head down and do what the sergeants tell you. It'll be over before you know it." But I knew better. I knew I was going to die, knew I'd freeze up in combat, knew I'd get myself and probably others killed because I was a coward who had no business being on the front line. Baker Company was down to about 60% strength after weeks of constant combat. The men looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, covered in dirt and wearing uniforms stiff with dried sweat and mud. They looked at me with contempt when I arrived. This clean clerk with his thick glasses and his obvious terror, clearly out of place among these hardened veterans. The company commander, a lieutenant who looked about 20 years old, assigned me to 3rd Platoon, told the sergeant to find me a spot in one of the rifle squads. The sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Kowalski with a face like leather, looked me up and down and shook his head. "Great. Just what we need. Another liability." He put me in 1st Squad under Corporal Davis, told me to stay close and follow orders and try not to get anyone killed. 1st Squad consisted of 8 men, including Davis. They were veterans, had been fighting since North Africa, and they treated me like I was invisible, like acknowledging my presence would somehow make me more real, and therefore more likely to get them killed. We spent the night in a hedgerow position, and I didn't sleep at all, just lay in my foxhole listening to distant artillery and imagining all the ways I was going to die the next day. Davis came by once during the night, found me shaking in my hole and said, "Look, Pritchard, I get it. You're scared. We're all scared. But tomorrow when we jump off, you need to move when I say move, shoot when I say shoot, and hit the ground when I say get down. You do that, you might survive. You freeze up or panic, you'll get killed and probably take someone else with you. Understand?" I nodded, unable to speak, and he moved on. The attack started at dawn. Artillery pounded the German positions for 30 minutes, then lifted, and we went over the hedgerow into the field beyond. I was in the middle of the squad following Davis, my rifle held so tightly my knuckles were white. We'd made it maybe 50 yards when the Germans opened up with machine gun fire from the hedgerow on the far side of the field. Men hit the ground immediately, returning fire, and I threw myself down so hard I knocked the breath out of my lungs. Bullets snapped overhead. That distinctive crack of rounds passing close, and I pressed my face into the dirt and prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. Davis was yelling orders, directing fire, trying to locate the machine gun position. Someone near me was hit and screaming for a medic. The noise was overwhelming. Nothing like what I'd imagined. Worse than any nightmare. I don't know how long I lay there. Probably only minutes, though it felt like hours. Davis crawled over to me, grabbed my shoulder and shook me hard. "Pritchard, I need you to move to that shell crater on the right and provide covering fire while we flank that machine gun. Move now." I stared at him, unable to process the order, unable to make my body obey. He shook me harder. Move, goddammit, that's an order. But I couldn't. I was frozen, completely paralyzed by fear, useless, exactly what I'd always known I'd be in combat. Davis cursed and crawled away to find someone else, and I lay there hating myself, despising my cowardice but unable to overcome it. The squad managed to suppress the machine gun enough to advance, and we moved forward in short rushes, gaining ground toward the far hedgerow. I stumbled along at the rear, not really helping, not really fighting, just trying not to get shot. We took the field eventually, killed the German machine gun crew, and pushed through into the next field. That's how the entire morning went, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, brutal fighting for tiny pieces of ground. I fired my rifle occasionally when ordered to, usually at nothing, just shooting in the general direction Davis pointed. I wasn't helping, wasn't contributing, was just dead weight being dragged along by better men. By early afternoon, Baker Company had advanced about half a mile and was exhausted. We'd taken casualties, lost maybe 20 men killed or wounded, and we were running low on ammunition. We set up defensive positions in a hedgerow overlooking a small village called La Minière, waiting for supplies and reinforcements before continuing the attack. I collapsed in a foxhole, completely drained physically and emotionally, ashamed of my performance, knowing everyone in the squad thought I was worthless. Davis sat down next to me, offered me his canteen, and said quietly, "You did okay, Pritchard. You kept moving, kept up with the squad. That's all anyone can ask." But I knew he was just being kind, trying to salvage some shred of my dignity. I hadn't done anything except not get killed. Around 3 in the afternoon, everything went to hell. The Germans counterattacked, tanks and infantry emerging from the village below us, catching us by surprise. Our positions were exposed. We had no anti-tank weapons, and the nearest artillery support was miles away. The company commander immediately ordered a withdrawal to the next hedgerow line, trying to gain distance from the tanks, trying to find better defensive terrain. The withdrawal was chaos, men running across open fields while German machine guns fired at them, while tanks fired their main guns and sent shells screaming overhead. I ran with the squad, pure panic driving me, expecting a bullet in the back with every step. We made it to the next hedgerow and took cover, but the situation was desperate. The Germans were pressing hard, tanks advancing slowly but steadily, infantry following behind. Our anti-tank mines were gone, used up in earlier fighting. We had no bazookas, no weapons that could stop armor. The company was strung out along the hedgerow in no particular order, squads and platoons mixed together in the confusion of the retreat. And then the radio operator near me took a bullet to the chest and went down, the radio smashed by the same burst that killed him. We'd lost communication with battalion, couldn't call for artillery or air support. We're on our own against an enemy that outgunned us completely. Lieutenant Hayes, the company commander, was trying to organize a defense moving along the hedgerow and positioning men, but it was clear we couldn't hold. The tanks would roll right over us. We'd be overrun and killed or captured. I could see the fear in everyone's faces, could feel the desperation, could sense that we were about to break and run. And then I saw something that changed everything. Off to the left, maybe 200 yards away, was a destroyed American tank knocked out in earlier fighting. It was a Sherman, burned out and abandoned, sitting in the middle of a field. And mounted on top of that tank, probably still functional, was a .50 caliber machine gun. In that moment, something clicked in my brain. I'd read the technical manual for the .50 cal, had studied it because I was the kind of person who read manuals, who prepared even for things I never expected to do. I knew how that weapon worked, knew how to load it and fire it and clear jams, and I realized that if someone could get to that tank, could get that machine gun working, they could cover our withdrawal, could maybe hold off the German infantry long enough for the company to escape. The German tanks wouldn't get close to a functioning .50 cal, would stay back and use their main guns, which would give us time. It was a desperate plan, probably suicidal, but it was the only chance I could see. I looked around for someone to tell, for an officer or sergeant who could make it happen. But Lieutenant Hayes was at the far end of the hedgerow, unreachable. Sergeant Kowalski was dead, killed in the retreat. Corporal Davis was organizing the men around him, couldn't be spared. There was no one else. No one except me, the coward, The clerk, the man everyone knew would fail when it mattered most. And in that moment, I made a decision that I still don't fully understand. I decided to go myself. I didn't think about it, didn't analyze it, didn't give myself time to realize how insane the plan was. I just stood up, threw my rifle down, and started running toward that tank. Behind me, I heard Davis yelling, "Pritchard, what the hell are you doing? Get back here." But I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran across that open field as fast as my skinny legs could carry me. German machine guns opened up immediately, bullets kicking up dirt all around me, snapping past my head. I expected to be hit with every step, expected to feel the impact and go down, but I kept running. A mortar round exploded to my right, the concussion knocking me sideways, but I stayed on my feet and kept going. 50 yards, 75, 100. The tank was getting closer, and impossibly I was still alive, still running, still moving toward that 50 cal that represented our only hope. I reached the tank and threw myself down beside it, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would explode. Bullets were hitting the tank with metallic pings, but the hull provided cover from the German positions. I forced myself to move, to climb up onto the tank, to get to the machine gun mount on top. The 50 cal was still there, still attached to its mount, covered in soot from the fire that had destroyed the tank, but apparently functional. I checked the ammunition box and found it half full, maybe 200 rounds. Not much, but enough if I used them carefully. My hands moved automatically, following the procedures I'd memorized from the manual but never actually performed. I charged the weapon, pulled back the bolt, checked that a round was chambered, the gun was ready to fire. I looked up and saw the German infantry advancing across the field toward our positions. Maybe 50 soldiers spread out in a skirmish line, moving steadily forward. Behind them, 2 tanks rolled slowly, supporting the advance. They were about 400 yards away, well within range of the 50 cal. This was it. This was my moment. Everything I'd been, every failure and every act of cowardice, came down to this. I could run, could abandon the gun and try to make it back to the hedgerow, save myself and let the company be overrun. Or I could do something I'd never done in my entire life. I could fight. I pulled the trigger, and the 50 caliber machine gun roared to life. The recoil was tremendous, the weapon bucking against my shoulder, but I held on and walked the fire into the advancing German infantry. I could see them going down, could see them scattering for cover, could see the neat line of their advance disintegrating into chaos. I fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition, switching targets, trying to create as much confusion as possible. The German tanks stopped advancing, their commanders probably surprised to find a functioning machine gun where there shouldn't be one. They started to traverse their turrets toward me, and I knew I had maybe seconds before they fired their main guns and blew me and the tank to pieces. But those seconds were enough. Behind me, I could hear Lieutenant Hayes shouting orders, organizing the withdrawal, getting the company moving back to safer positions. The Germans were pinned down by my fire, unable to advance, giving our men the time they needed to escape. I kept firing, burst after burst, the barrel of the 50 cal starting to glow red from the heat. A German tank fired, the shell screaming past my head and exploding in the field beyond. They had my range now, and the next shot would probably kill me. But I kept firing, kept my finger on that trigger, kept that gun roaring because every second I could buy was another second for my friends to get away. The ammunition box ran dry, the bolt locking back on an empty chamber. I'd fired every round, had nothing left. I looked back toward the American lines and saw that most of the company had made it to the next hedgerow. We're in cover, we're safe for the moment. My job was done. The German tanks were moving again, closing the range, and I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before they were close enough for a sure kill. I had to run, had to try to make it back, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, a complete draining of every bit of energy I had. I'd done the impossible, had found courage I never knew I possessed, and now I had nothing left. Then Davis was there somehow, running across the field toward me. He grabbed my arm and hauled me off the tank, and we ran together back toward the American lines. German machine guns fired at us, bullets everywhere, and I still don't know how we weren't hit. We dove over the hedgerow into safety, and I collapsed, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Davis was checking me for wounds, asking if I was hit, but I couldn't answer. I just lay there and shook, coming down from an adrenaline high unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The German attack stalled after that. Without the momentum of their advance, without the infantry support for their tanks, they pulled back to the village and dug in. Our artillery finally got the call for fire mission sorted out and started pounding their positions, and by evening, the danger had passed. Baker Company had escaped what would have been a disaster, had made it to safety with casualties but intact. And it was because of me, because the coward had found 30 seconds of courage when it mattered most. The aftermath was surreal. Lieutenant Hayes came to find me, shook my hand, called me a hero. Sergeant Kowalski's replacement, another grizzled veteran, said I'd saved the company, that without covering fire from that 50 cal, we would have been overrun. The men in First Squad treated me differently, looked at me with something like respect, even Davis, who'd clearly thought I was worthless that morning. Word spread through the battalion about what happened, about the clerk who'd run 400 yards across open ground under fire to man an abandoned machine gun and hold off an entire German infantry company. It became a story that got embellished with each telling, became larger than what actually happened, became a legend that I didn't recognize as having anything to do with me. Captain Morrison came out from headquarters the next day with a colonel from division. They interviewed me, asked for details, wrote everything down. The colonel told me I was being recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, for extraordinary heroism in action. I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. Me? The coward? The clerk everyone had written off? It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. But it was real, was happening, was my new reality whether I understood it or not. I was pulled off the line after that, sent back to headquarters, given my desk job back. There was some talk of promoting me, of using me for publicity, but I refused. I didn't want attention, didn't want to be a poster boy, didn't want my face in newspapers or my story told to sell war bonds. I just wanted to go back to being Harold Pritchard, clerk, invisible and forgettable. But I couldn't go back. I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross, had discovered something about myself that changed everything I thought I knew about who I was. The award ceremony happened in August, after we'd broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. The division was pulled out of the line for rest and refit, and they held the ceremony in a field near Paris. The colonel pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to my chest while the entire battalion stood in formation and watched. I felt like a fraud, like I was wearing a medal meant for someone else, someone braver and more deserving. But I accepted it, stood there at attention while they read the citation describing actions that sounded heroic when stripped of the context of terror and desperation and blind panic that had actually characterized them. After the ceremony, Davis pulled me aside and said something I've never forgotten. "You know what the difference was, Pritchard? Between this morning when you couldn't move and that afternoon when you ran across 400 yards of open ground? The morning was about you. You were scared for yourself, focused on your own survival, and that fear paralyzed you. But the afternoon was about us. You saw we were in trouble, saw we needed help, and you stopped thinking about yourself and started thinking about your friends. That's what courage is, Pritchard. It's not being unafraid. It's caring about something more than your own fear. You found something worth being brave for, and that made all the difference." I thought about his words for a long time, and I think he was right. I'd spent my entire life focused on myself, on my own safety and comfort, and that self-focus had made me weak. But for 30 seconds in that field, I'd stopped thinking about myself and started thinking about the men around me. The soldiers who'd tolerated my presence despite my uselessness, who'd tried to keep me alive despite being handicapped by my cowardice. I couldn't let them die. I couldn't stand by and watch them be overrun when I could see a way to help, even if that way was insane and suicidal. For 30 seconds, something else had been more important than my fear, and that had been enough. I continued working as a clerk for the rest of the war, processing paperwork while other men fought. I was never sent back to the line, never asked to be a combat soldier again. I was grateful for that, relieved to return to my safe job, to my desk and my typewriter and my orderly world of forms and reports. But I was different now. The other clerks treated me with a respect they hadn't shown before. Officers who'd previously ignored me nodded when they passed my desk. Men I didn't know would stop by headquarters to meet the clerk who'd saved Baker Company, to shake my hand and thank me. It was uncomfortable and awkward, and I never quite got used to it, but I accepted it as part of my new reality. The war ended in May 1945, and I came home to Cleveland a few months later. My family had heard about the medal, had read newspaper accounts of my actions, and they greeted me like I was some kind of war hero. My father, who'd always been disappointed in my lack of physical prowess and masculine aggression, looked at me with something like pride for the first time in my life. My mother cried and held me and told everyone she met about her son, the hero. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like I'd discovered something unexpected about myself, something that had been buried under layers of fear and self-doubt, something that emerged only when circumstances demanded it. I'd found courage I didn't know I had acted in ways completely contrary to my nature and my history, and I still didn't fully understand how or why. I went back to accounting after the war, got my old job back at the firm I'd worked for before being drafted. I married a wonderful woman named Dorothy, raised 2 children, lived a quiet, ordinary life. But I carried that afternoon in France with me always, carried the memory of running across that field, of manning that machine gun, of doing something that the Harold Pritchard of before the war could never have done. It became my secret strength, my private knowledge that I was capable of more than I'd believed, that circumstances could reveal character I didn't know I possessed. Over the years, I stayed in touch with some of the men from Baker Company. Davis and I exchanged Christmas cards for decades, maintained a friendship forged in combat. He told me once in a letter that I'd changed his understanding of courage, that before that afternoon he'd believed bravery was something innate, something you either had or didn't have. But watching me transform from a paralyzed coward in the morning to a hero in the afternoon had shown him that courage could emerge unexpectedly, that people could surprise you and surprise themselves. That meant more to me than any medal, the knowledge that my moment of unexpected bravery had changed how someone else viewed human potential. I attended a Baker Company reunion in the 1990s, probably the last one, as most of the men were quite old by then or had already passed. There were maybe 15 of us left, gray-haired and slow-moving, gathering to remember battles fought 50 years earlier. Someone asked me to tell the story of that afternoon in France, and I did, as accurately as I could remember it. When I finished, one of the veterans, a man I didn't remember from the war, said something that struck me deeply. "You know what I think, Pritchard? I think you weren't a coward who became brave for 30 seconds. I think you were brave all along, but you didn't have the right circumstances to prove it. Some men are brave in ways that are obvious, charging machine gun nests and throwing themselves on grenades. But some men are brave in quieter ways, just getting through each day despite their fear, doing their jobs even when they're terrified. You did that for months before that afternoon. You showed up, did your duty, kept going even though you were scared out of your mind. That's courage, too." What happened that afternoon wasn't a transformation. It was just the moment when everyone else finally saw what was already there. I've thought about his words often in the years since. Maybe he was right. Maybe I'd been judging myself by the wrong standards, seeing my fear as weakness rather than recognizing that continuing to function despite overwhelming fear was its own kind of strength. Maybe courage isn't about being unafraid, or even about dramatic acts of heroism. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just about showing up, doing what needs to be done, finding the strength to act when action is required, even when everything inside you wants to run away. If that's true, then maybe I wasn't the unexpected hero at all. Maybe I was the same person I'd always been, just finally given the circumstances where that person could shine through. I'm 94 years old now, one of the last survivors of the 1st Infantry Division's campaigns in World War II. The men I served with are mostly gone, their stories fading with them. When people ask me about the war, about my medal, about that afternoon in France, I tell them the truth. I was the most unlikely hero you can imagine, a coward who'd spent his entire life running from confrontation, who froze up in his first combat action, who was utterly convinced he had nothing to offer. And then circumstances demanded something of me, and I found that I had more to give than I'd believed possible. I found courage I didn't know I possessed, found the strength to act when action was desperately needed, found that the line between cowardice and heroism is thinner than we think, and that sometimes we don't know which side of that line we're on until we're tested. That's what I want people to understand from my story. Not that I was special or unique or particularly brave, but that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. That courage isn't a fixed trait, but something that can emerge unexpectedly, surprising everyone, including ourselves. That the weakest person in your unit, the one everyone has written off, might be the one who saves everyone when the moment comes. That we contain multitudes, possibilities we never explore, strengths we never test, until we're pushed beyond our limits and discover we had further to go than we imagined. I keep my Distinguished Service Cross in a drawer in my bedroom. Don't display it. Don't talk about it much. It represents something important, but it's not the sum of who I am or what I did during the war. It's just a medal and ribbon, recognition of one afternoon out of years of service. What matters more to me are the letters I've received over the decades from the men of Baker Company, thanking me for buying them time to escape, for giving them the chance to go home to their families, for finding courage when they needed it most. What matters are the children and grandchildren of those men, people who exist because their fathers and grandfathers survived that afternoon in France. What matters is knowing that for 30 seconds, I was exactly who I needed to be, who my friends needed me to be, who I never imagined I could be. That's my story of unexpected heroism. Not glorious, not particularly dramatic when you strip away the embellishment, just a scared clerk who ran across a field and fired a machine gun and bought his friends time to escape. But it changed my life, changed how I viewed myself, changed my understanding of what people are capable of when pushed to their limits. I went into that field as Harold Pritchard, the coward, the clerk, the failure. I came out as someone else, someone who'd discovered that labels and expectations and even self-knowledge can be wrong, that we're all capable of more than we believe, that heroes can emerge from the most unlikely places when circumstances demand heroism. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about courage and heroism and human potential, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. These stories matter because they show that ordinary people, flawed and frightened and full of doubt, can rise to meet extraordinary challenges. They show that heroes aren't born. They're made in moments of crisis, forged by necessity and desperation and love for the people around them. Thank you for listening to this old soldier's story about the day he discovered he was braver than he knew. Thank you for remembering that heroism can come from unexpected places, and that courage is something we all possess, waiting for the right moment to emerge.